p.m. Friday, September 8th. I now call this work session to order. This is a work session regarding the 120-day memo. So this meeting is called essentially to provide for the Assembly its first conversation about the budget process in earnest. The code provides that a 120-day memo is provided to the Assembly with essential details of the budget process coming forward. 120 days means 120 days till it's in effect. So we are getting close to the budget year and it's time to get started in earnest. So thank you everybody for being here. Each year as part of the process, the administration presents a capital improvement plan, including the 6-year outlook for municipal capital requests and a capital improvement budget, the upcoming year's specific requests to the Assembly for approval alongside the operating budget. These include road projects, park upgrades, library renovations, and more that make up the bond propositions that go to the voters for approval and to the legislature and the delegation in DC for state and federal funding requests. The first step in the process is the 120-day memo. At least 120 days before the end of the fiscal year, the mayor is required by code to submit to the Assembly a preliminary general government capital budget, capital program, and utilities capital budget, capital program. In the past, the Assembly began review of the capital projects in late October. In an effort to provide more transparency and opportunity for community input, and also an opportunity for us as members to make sure that the budget reflects our community's interests, we are beginning this process much earlier this year. I'd like to thank members of the administration and Office of Management and Budget for responding so quickly to AO 2023-85, which we just passed a few weeks ago, and providing an additional level of detail on capital projects proposed in the 120-day memo. The benefits of this new process include open and transparent communications with the community, more back and forth between the Assembly administration before a final package is solidified, and greater public dialogue and vetting of projects ensures that bond packages and legislative requests are more thought out and have greater community buy-in. So let's get started. Today, the goals are a chance for the Assembly and the public to review specifics put forward by the administration in our first round of vetting and public dialogue to hone in on the projects that are finalized with budget vote in late November. So next, we'll review and discuss the 120-day memo. And since OMB isn't here, though they may arrive around 2 o'clock, it would be beneficial to have somebody do a brief summary and review of the documents. And I think in this case, by virtue of kind of current dynamics, that presentation is going to be made by the budget co-chairs. So with that, I'm going to turn over the floor to Ms. Alatil and Ms. Brawley to begin the conversation in earnest.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the way that Co-Chair Brawley and I have approached this is to create a draft resolution, which you have a copy of. And what we've done with the draft resolution is we have so we've reviewed the 120-day memo. We do have some questions, but absent those questions being able to be answered quite yet, we think that it's a good idea to put forward kind of where we're at as a body on this next year's budget. And so what we've recommended, and it's really in section 1 in the resolves, is a starting point. And we're hoping the discussion here today is that not only can we get a better idea of the projected fiscal picture from the municipality, from the administration, but where do your budget priorities lie for next year? We took a stab at some of them based on conversations we've had and things we know, but we do want to hear more. And the idea here is, as we are more transparent about our budget priorities, there's the opportunity for the administration to take them and incorporate them into the budget. And we can see where we already have alignment. So it might make the amendment process later more smooth. So that is where we're at with the memorandum or the AR before you. We do intend to lay this on the table Tuesday night because of the timing of this work session, and then being able to get your feedback so that we could kind of do something that was really up to date. Otherwise, if we waited till the second meeting in September, we do start to creep up on the budget process itself and aren't out in front enough to provide the administration a chance to possibly add in some of our priorities.
Yeah, thank you to my co-chair because that summarizes it very well. And the other piece that I'll add just for information, this has been shared in basically every budget and finance committee meeting this year, but we are not starting from an ideal place in terms of information we have because we still don't know what the end of 2022 looked like. So 2 fiscal year or yeah, we're talking about FY24. We don't know exactly what the end of FY22 looked like in terms of fund balance, in terms of, we have a general picture because we know we have a number of vacancies. So we expect to see, for example, departments underspending because there aren't the people, the positions filled. And then we also know there's things like overtime. So we don't exactly know where all that shook out, but we have some idea that would probably, there was some underspending in 2022. And then we also, we're in the middle of 2023. And so because the backlog of 2022, we also don't have maybe the level of information that we would have had in a prior year at this point. And so I also just want to share that because part of the budgeting process is looking at things like fund balance, for example, in the alcohol tax or in general government. And being able to think about reappropriating those funds to other priorities, or maybe the same priority, but carrying it forward into a new year, using that fund balance as a one-time investment. And I'll use the example of a lot of the funding with homelessness using the alcohol tax. So some of that was originally appropriated. Other ways that we've been able to fund programs, one-time capital expenditures, things like that for homelessness and for housing and other priorities has been using fund balance. And so the way that we've been able to be responsive to our current needs is through using that. And so just to say, we expect to see that information, but we don't have it yet. And so that leaves us in a bit of a disadvantaged position compared to previous years and compared to the way this process is supposed to work. And so what we have now is this, and then we have some speculation, and then we have the best information we've gotten so far about 2022 and current year 2023.
All right, so I don't see anyone here from the administration. Oh, Mia's here, okay. Who is, you're blocked by 2 people, Ms. Costello, so I literally, if you want to come up and provide any introduction, because I think that the chairs are ready to dive into it. Do members have questions they want to bring up? Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Structurally, at some point during this work session, are we going to go over the resolution?
Yes, first round of intro questions, and then I think that's fair. Yeah, I think
Okay.
that's fair. So anyone else have questions? Ms. Bronga?
Well, this may be jumping ahead, but on the first page, the general government revenue and marijuana sales tax, why is that there's a big decrease? It shows 5,700,000.
It's dedicated now.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, it's dedicated. So there is a gap there of that amount of money that was previously in the general fund, which is now in a dedicated fund for grants and other projects. So and on that page, it's a decrease in general government revenue. Yeah, that's what that is reflected. Okay, so I'm going to just have a little philosophical moment first. Having read through the document, the memo on September 1, I just want to read this out so people can understand what it's saying. It says, with the 2024 budget before us, my top priority of protecting taxpayers continues to remain at the forefront. Taxing to the cap and raising taxes on burdened property owners continue to be a non-starter. Then he goes on to say, the administration has worked with all departments and prepared a reduced budget that maintains the level of services. So there's a simple arithmetic problem with that statement. It's magical thinking. It's magical thinking. We are going to lower taxes and provide the level of services you demand. I think if you were to ask almost anybody in this town, they would tell you the level of services the municipality at this time are not meeting the mark as they're funded, let alone is the funding sufficient to do the job, or the positions and the people in the jobs, or the response to certain endemic problems that we're trying to tackle. And so I just have to start by pointing out what I find magical thinking right at the front of this document. So now I'm going to hand over to, again, the chairs to describe their proposed resolution.
Great, thank you. So the resolution is really structured around what we know as of right now. And it really sets forward kind of what we learned from AEDC about projections around vehicle and room rental revenues as well, which if you remember last year, the projections on room tax was a real point of contention between the Assembly and the administration. And we ended up passing a budget based on projections the Assembly put forward, not the ones originally presented by the administration. And we, if OMB were here, we do have some questions about the 120-day memo suggesting a increase in vehicle tax, but not a concurrent one in room tax. And those two usually go hand in hand. They usually increase at kind of the same. Additionally, we have mixed information right now about what the revenue picture is based on the 120-day memo. What we do know is that the departments were directed to prepare 3 budget scenarios, a flat budget or continuation budget, as we like to call it, and cuts of 2% and 4%. Then the next paragraph really talks about posing that the administration's posed a relatively flat preliminary revenue estimate despite the economic forecasts we received from AEDC, and stating their priority to maintain a level of public services that residents of Anchorage expect. I think to maybe put a finer point on that, that's juxtaposed with the vacancies we know we have. And one way, of course, to cut expenses is to not fill those vacancies, but then that means we will continue to have the service lags and concerns we've heard through those departments. Additionally, so then we go on to talk about those vacancies in particular, which I think has been a concern for the body for quite some time. And then if you look at the last budget to actuals we had, which are in June of 23, this is on the top of the second page, we see that many budgets are very underspent. And we know that's because of vacancies. And so we want to be real about that. And I think we have a policy choice to make. We have the policy choice to reduce the budget by reducing those positions, or we can do everything we can to get our municipal workforce in full effect and back to a robust state. We then talk about the marijuana tax, particularly Proposition 14, put that outside of the cap with $1 million offset from the cap. And we did in first quarter of 23, there's a typo there. This is why this says draft, anticipated the impacts by ensuring that $1 million of our budget at first quarter were one-time expenditures that wouldn't be moved into a continuation posture for the next year. Usually one-time expenditures just go away. And so that's kind of the background of how we arrived at these very broad policy statements, that it's our belief that the basis for the 24 budget should be a continuation budget, and that we ensure adequate funding for core municipal services to include winter maintenance and snow plowing for roads and sidewalks, public safety and emergency services, fiscal responsibility, including seeking efficiencies and highest return on investment for public dollars spent, and maintaining a high level of service across all departments. Those are really broad, and what we're hoping is in this discussion, maybe to get a little bit more particularity. I know one I would like to add is trying to maintain the proportional allocations in the alcohol tax by dedication, so that one of the dedications doesn't necessarily subsume a majority of the tax. Anna, Ms. Brawley, did you have anything else you wanted to add about kind of how we structured the memo? Or the AR?
Not specifically here, but I think when we have some time, I also want to give some bigger picture context in terms of how the tax cap works and the factors in it, and then some of the other external factors. But I think that gets more into the 120-day memo itself.
So I have two people in the queue. I believe it's on the resolution, Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm not exactly sure how this is incorporated in here, or if maybe it needs to be a little bit more explicit. But I am reading particularly section 1 and part 2 of that, and readings C and D. And when I read those two together, one of the things that I think is missing is really talking about staffing. And I heard you, Ms. Alato, talk about staffing and vacancies. So I think we should incorporate that somehow into that, because otherwise, if I'm just reading this as a municipal employee, I would feel pretty exhausted of efficiencies and maintaining a high level of services. But I think if we also talk about, and we need to make sure that we are filling those vacancies, I think that would be critical.
Mr. Volland, and then Mr. Martinez, and then Ms. Burley.
Thank you. I appreciate that this addresses winter maintenance, including snow plowing of roads and sidewalks. And I think that's a perfect example of what we ran into last budget cycle, where a continuation budget is not always maintaining the same level of service. And we, as the assembly, we brought forward, we wanted to increase the budget for snow plowing from streets and sidewalks by $1 million. And then we found out, well, this was after the work session, night of, from the dais, we were having to make the sausage and go up another 500,000, because we found out that night that even increasing the budget by $1 million would just maintain the same level of service. And a lot of that was because of those unfilled vacancies and the fact that we were so understaffed, despite the fact that the administration had been warned that summer, hey, you need to staff up or you're going to run into a potential winter failure. So absolutely the connection between level of service, budget, vacancies that exist is crucial. So I guess I'll just say that I appreciate that it highlights that. Thanks.
So Mr. Martinez.
Thank you. Yes, something to potentially add. I think that I appreciate winter maintenance, snow plowing of roads and sidewalks. We're not necessarily the most sidewalk-friendly city, but there are often bus stops where there aren't sidewalks. So yeah, would love to add in public transportation facilities, bus stops, and you get the picture on that. Thank you.
All right, next I have Ms. Barley, then myself.
Yeah, thank you. And this is responding to 2C that was raised, the comment about fiscal responsibility and seeking efficiencies. I think there's many ways to interpret that phrase. And I think it is a good value to have, right? That we have fiscal responsibility. We need to balance our budget. And so the question is really, what policy decisions do you make? And so to my mind, when I look at that, I think seeking efficiencies is not in the sense of how many positions can we cut. It's really, how do we right size either the positions or the functions, or really where we're putting our dollars. So for example, efficiencies, we know from this past year that we have had to hire accountants as contractors that cost more, that require basically training how to understand our city system, and they are not permanent employees. And so that training is to get their job done for that particular contract. It is not an investment in that employee understanding and building the institutional knowledge. And so that is an inefficient use of money. It is a necessity because we have federal deadlines we have to meet. We have to balance our books and make sure we know the state of our finances. And so there I see the vacancies have created an inefficiency that required us to hire contractors. And that is also against the general principle that we want permanent employees doing municipal work, generally speaking. And then that's setting aside the implications for, our labor agreements and things like that, because we do have a unionized workforce for the most part. Another one is highest return on investment for our public dollars. Again, that one way to look at that is simply cutting services or assuming that the private sector will provide things that traditionally the public sector is responsible for. For example, the Anchorage Safety Center, we've had issues with the fact that we have a contractor, and it's not inherently because it's a contractor, but they are not able to maintain staffing. And so that public service was at risk, and it was on the back of a private provider. And so thinking again about efficiencies, what is our role? And then the highest return on public dollars spent, I think that's part of the conversation that we've had specifically with the alcohol tax. But I think we should be thinking generally, how do we stop the flow of funding and attention into the highest level of emergency service that doesn't always produce the outcomes that we want, and how do we move upstream over time so that we're investing up front? And so again, I think there's multiple ways to interpret these things, but at least from my perspective, the fiscal responsibility and efficiencies is about maintaining those principles of public service, and again, maintaining employment, because that is the way that our city is designed, is that city employees are providing city services.
So I had myself in the queue. I have then Ms. Braga, Mr. Salt, and Mr. Rivera back in the queue. So, and for my part, I have two things. One, on the employee piece, I hope we don't just speak about it in the context of vacancies, but also in the context of creating retention, systems that make employees feel valued, right? Because the ones we've trained, we should figure out how to keep. There's a high value there. So I want to make sure we talk about that. And then there's another one, and this is just instructive to the administration if anyone tunes in. So for the past 2 years, the administration has come forward with a budget, and we've tried to signal, hey, we're willing to work with you, work with us. And then no comment, no conversation, the budget comes out. And then at the end, the assembly, as it's organized, does what it does, which is finalize a budget that the assembly believes in, which means it's like a train wreck at the end, because the administration has a proposal and it's not going to happen because there was no work and alignment. And so this communication, if passed, should stand as a signal to the administration. This is our starting negotiating point toward a final product that you have an opportunity to have some say in, should we choose to work together. So I think that's an important kind of element to this communication, is here we are and we're willing, ready and able to have a conversation. Next, thank you, Ms. Braga.
Thank you, Chair. I was proposing in this section 1, the number 2, where you have A, B, C, D, that the winter maintenance, huge, but the dignified sheltering of people experiencing homelessness goes even higher on my list. If I was to look at the emails about snow plowing, and granted, I wasn't on the assembly till later, but it has just been a constant barrage of concerns from businesses, including, a woman who runs Pip Printing crying on the phone to me about what it's like there. Tourism, livability of neighborhoods, use of trails and parks, and attracting and retaining people who are turned off by what the city's looking like. So we don't have a funding stream to help with this, is my understanding. And I think we can't ignore this huge elephant in the room.
All right, thank you. Mr. Salt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to build on what some others have said, Alaska has a pretty high employee participation rate. So with that, what Mr. Constant said, I think I'd add development to it, because the employees just aren't out there. We've got to learn how to grow our employees and definitely retain them. And then what Ms. Brawley said, automation, modernization, technology. There's less workers out there. So if it can be automated, it should be automated. If we can bring in technology to help us, they make robotic lawnmowers nowadays, things like that. I actually saw one in use on a municipal highway, not here. We just have to recognize that fact, that workforce, and I see it in my industry, they're physically not in the state. So we got to look at other alternatives. Thanks.
Next in the queue is Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I guess a couple things. First, on the resolution, can one of the co-sponsors please tell me who the intended audience is for this resolution?
The administration.
Okay, yeah, thanks. That's what I thought. So then I guess what I would suggest just to make sure that the administration doesn't misinterpret our words, which I am very concerned about, because I appreciate your explanation, Ms. Brawley, but that was like 3 or 4 minutes. And I don't think we should assume that the administration is going to interpret these words the same way that you did in your 3 or 4 minutes. So I would suggest that an AM be attached to this resolution that really explains what you mean in by all of these different phrases. Thanks. And then the second thing is, with regard to how we incorporate homelessness, I think if we are going to incorporate homelessness as one of these sort of core adequate funding areas, or however it gets incorporated in this resolution, I would urge that housing in some form also gets incorporated, that we can't just focus on one half of that puzzle. We have to focus on the whole equation. And then, I think interestingly enough, well, actually, I won't mention that. Thanks.
Okay. Ms. Alto, then Mr. Cross.
Thank you. So for procedurally, it's the intention that we can hopefully get this to our late on the table state and circulate it to you all on Monday. So that way, if you have amendments you want to bring, that's available. If we didn't agree or didn't capture something, that's available. Just for a little bit of background, I was elected in 2019, and in that year for the 2020 budget, I proposed a 2% across the board cut to provide adequate funding for shelter for homelessness. We managed to get $730,000 in the health department's budget, and that was the first substantial funding that ever went in for that purpose. And that was really hard to get. Partly because I think one way to think about this budget is there's very few places often defined for cuts. We have depreciation, which makes up a huge portion of the budget, public safety, and then road maintenance. And once you get to that, then you are looking at cutting departments that have very small portions of the budget. So it's just something to keep in mind as we think about if you need to cut in order to get a priority met versus trying to find other revenue sources or opportunities. And I think that's the tension in our budget and our lack of diversification of revenues in the municipality. Thank you.
Next, I have Mr. Cross.
Yes, thank you. Heard a long time, if you want to know where somebody's values are, just look at their checkbook, right? See where they spend it. So I just wanted to make sure that this reflects what we've already established as our assembly priorities. And I just concur with what Felix said as far as just making sure that we've always said housing was one of our top priorities. I can see how it lumps in here, or it's covered under a myriad of these different descriptions, but as long as our budget priorities reflect what we've identified as our assembly priorities. And then I also think that, but at the same time, I like that we're giving some direction ahead of time in order for the administration to understand what we're more likely to accept or reject when the budget comes out from the mayor. But at the same time, I think it's important to not keep it overly complicated or overly detailed, because that work happens when we really dig into it at further work sessions as we go later in the year. Thank you.
So I have one quick question, and maybe I missed it. So since this is being proposed to be laid on the table, was it described why it's going to be time sensitive so that we can get the votes?
Yes, because we are already after the addendum deadline today. So we wanted to get a few of our questions answered to make sure our guidance was in line, maybe more in alignment than we thought, because we have some CPI, consumer price index, inflation, and revenue projection questions. We'll see if anyone's here by 2, maybe we can get those answered. And then we wanted to we didn't have this work session scheduled till today. If we wait until the second meeting in September, we miss the opportunity for this to possibly have any influence on the budgets as they're being provided.
I think that's really the key, is the time is of the essence, because the budget train is moving and it's moving quick. Okay, so go ahead, Ms. Alto.
Yep. One I would like to add is as a policy considerations, we need to respect the independent nature of enterprise and utilities. They bring in the revenue that they spend. So an across the board cut doesn't make a ton of sense for those, especially as we've heard at many enterprise and utility committee meetings, like AWU is already working toward its next requests to the RCA for a rate increase, and a lot of work goes into that. Solid Waste Services is on a very specific master plan that was already accepted by the Assembly. We already took up the tariff with the port. So I think we need to continue to keep that separate and distinct from how we think about other parts of the municipal budget.
Anyone else? Ms. Branca?
So could you just clarify? So you're saying like an E added to that page where we keep enterprise utilities separate?
Possibly a 3.
Okay.
Because it's not really ensure adequate funding of core municipal
true.
services. So the structure will maybe shift a little bit as we incorporate all of these things. But yeah, there will either be more numbers or more letters or both.
And I just think that the main point is our enterprises and utilities are charged with running independently, and have their own budgets and their own process and their own revenues and their own expenses. And it just doesn't make a lot of sense to levy a reduction in budget to an entity that's operating an independent process. Their board, their people should make those calls. And it's balanced by their revenues and expenses. It is our asset, but it's ours at an arm's length. And so making the blanket argument, those budgets should be treated the same way as the rest of our budgets, it just doesn't add up. Anyhow, anyone else? Ms. Broadley?
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, this is actually would be switching gears, but I believe we do have time. My intent would be to not walk through the 120-day memo and explain the policy choices in it, but since we have the opportunity, I think it would be helpful to discuss with members some basic mechanics of the tax cap calculation. And then specifically, I want to come back to that question about inflation and cost.
So I think my response would be, I'm glad it's you and not me.
Okay. And again, this is not speaking for the administration. If there are questions about what numbers were chosen in here or why, those are not questions I'm going to be able to answer, nor am I going to answer them. But I want to turn us to, it looks like page 5, it says B, page 1 of 1, which is the tax limit calculation in attachment B in the 120-day memo. So I'll let folks turn to that. And again, this is my general understanding of how this works, but I want to point to a couple areas because I think this discussion about taxing to the cap and what that means, again, I may not have even been born when the tax cap was created, so I can't speak to the intent of it, but I can speak to how it works now. And it is a formula. So starting with step 1, essentially our budget is built by looking at what our budget looked like last year. And so the intent of a continuation budget is starting with last year's budget as the starting point. So we don't start with 0. We're not starting from blank. We're assuming that if nothing else changes, we move that budget forward and we make changes to things like inflation or planned salary increases, things like that. So a continuation budget does not have the same exact numbers as last year, but it's the same policy decision. So that's what that means. And then specifically for the tax cap calculation, step 1 is that you start with the prior year. So you start with all of the taxes that were collected the prior year. So you'll see property tax, auto tax, all of the ones there. And then you will not see alcohol tax listed here because again, that is a dedicated separate tax. And so that's why it doesn't appear on these documents. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it's not calculated as our general operating budget. So you start there and then you can follow along as you see it's got the revised budget from 2023 and then this preliminary. And of course, this is what the administration will bring forward in a month as their actual proposal with policy decisions in it. The next one is you back out prior exclusions not subject to the limit. So that means you can see it's judgments and settlements, debt service, basically things that are not intended to be part of this tax cap formula. So there's things that we subtract out for various reasons. Then step 3, and this is the one I want to talk about a little bit, adjust for population and inflation. So this is part of the tax cap formula. So what it does, and it's required to do regardless of any other policy decisions, is 2 things. It looks at the 5-year average of our population, and then it either and it looks at the percent increase or decrease. And so essentially in our budget formula, because we lose population, our budget goes down. And that is not, there's no discretion there. That is the way that our tax cap formula works. That is one piece. And so you'll see our 5-year average is a slight decrease. And so one of the implications of losing people in our city, losing population, is that it requires our budget to go down by default. So that is not a policy choice we can make. That is a policy choice people made 40 years ago when they made the tax cap. That's one really important piece to understand. And so for many years, Anchorage was growing in population. And so correspondingly, the assumption was that the cost to provide public services to a growing population also grows. The question is, given that we have a lot of fixed costs, everything from collecting property taxes to road maintenance, all of those other pieces, and that all requires people. The assumption built into our budget is that if our population goes down, those costs automatically go down. And so I have questions or I would challenge that assumption, but that is one of the assumptions in our budgets. So that's one. And so as you see, as we lose population, we are required to, last year we took out $1.66 million out of our budget just because of our population loss. This year, we're projected to take about 1.38 million out of our budget just because of population loss. Oh, go ahead, Ms. Bronca.
So I was wondering, also our population is aging, and I think it's totally appropriate that there's a tax break for seniors. But does that take into account too that they're?
No, these are formulas, and so it's simply looking at. I would assume it's looking at the census data or some established public data source that says how many people we have living in our city. So it doesn't care how old you are. It's just saying how many people live in this city at this point.
So there is, though, the senior property tax exemption. So there may be more of those taken, but those aren't necessarily in the calculation of how much we are allowed to tax. And then it becomes a matter of how much we collect for taxes. And we have to reconcile those things, which is why we do like first quarter budget revisions and other pieces.
So just a finer point on that, doesn't actually change how much we collect. It changes how much we collect from whom. Right.
Oh, gotcha.
Right. And so there's that second factor that you have to account for, the tax cap, the big umbrella, and then each individual has their part relative to the ad valorem value of their property, and then whatever elements that they're allowed to take as exemptions. It's pie, though, that gets shifted. So anytime we talk about a tax exemption or other element, it goes somewhere.
Thank you. Steep learning curve. And that's also when we give a tax abatement to a property, that amount of money is getting spread out to other people's property taxes.
Or business taxes,
Or business.
or real property, or depending. But yes, that's always the math.
Thanks.
Mr. Cross.
Yeah, Anna, what you bring up here is really interesting, and I think it's a really important economic factor that individuals don't take into consideration, is that a decreasing population, particularly depending on the age group, can have significant cost increases, because with a smaller workforce, you're working people more overtime hours, or you're having to increase their wages. And although you may be servicing slightly fewer people because of the redistribution of labor, because you still have the same square footage of buildings, same amount of roads, same streetlights, and those services that need to be constantly maintained, the cost of space actually goes up. So the best thing you can do is create a vibrant economy where people want to move to, so you have more of a plethora of talent to pull from that keeps those costs under control. So very interesting. Thank you.
Continue.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And I want to also preface to say, what we're looking at right now is a formula. It is not, I mean, granted, there are some policy decisions, we can get there in a minute. But essentially, these things are required in our charter, and this is part of building the budget. Before we get to any other discussion about cuts, what departments, what increases, all of those things. So this is really just really fundamental to understand. And I think it's something that gets lost in discussions about the tax cap. So that's why I'm spending time on it. Also because we don't have the administration yet, and so we have the time. So the second piece I want to go to, and I won't, there's not as much detail to go into on these others, but I want to spend a lot of time on step 3 because it is really critical. The first one, as I said, when our population goes down, it automatically requires our budget to go down a certain point. And because it's a 5-year average, it also smooths out spikes, right? So maybe we had 100,000 people move here last year, and I know that's not the case, but even if we did, that would not show up here except insofar as it would bump up the 5-year average. And I think we're also familiar, I think, with the PFD calculation. That's looking at the performance of the last 5 years of the stock market. And so there's a lag in, it goes up if the stock market does well, but that doesn't show up necessarily in the same year that you're getting your PFD. So again, this is kind of trying to understand these formulas and the pros and cons of them. The second one, let's go on to Consumer Price Index, or CPI. So again, it says change in consumer index, 5-year average. So again, it's smoothing it out. What we know from the last 2 years in particular, or really 3 years, is we've had a huge spike in inflation. However, because of this 5-year formula, there's going to be a lag in showing the impacts and the allowance for a higher budget because of that inflation. So for example, last year it says the 3.3 increase average inflation. So that allowed adding in the assumption that the budget would go up by $11 million. So that is recognizing inflation. It's the cost of all of these pieces. This memo projects a 2.8 increase. So again, it's less than last year. And I think anecdotally, we've heard that inflation did spike last year, and it's going down to some extent. However, I want to also unpack the fact that the Consumer Price Index is an average of a lot of different categories. And it's important to understand two things. One is that for certain things in Alaska, our costs are extremely higher. And these aren't, it's not that these aren't factored into these formulas, but I think it's important to understand and think about the differential between all of these averages and the assumptions here versus what the actual experience and the actual economic impacts on us are. So I'll give an example, and I'm looking at the July 2023 Alaska economic trends, and I'll just pull out a few of them. One is that our housing costs are 36% higher than the US average in Anchorage, and that is from 2022. So again, that is a very high inflation year. But I think the baseline is that we know housing costs are higher. And I think that's an obvious point. But the question is that fact adequately reflected in these assumptions about the CPI? The second one is utilities. And I pulled that one out because it is over 100% higher than the US average. And so that includes, and again, this is Anchorage. We're not talking statewide. And so housing and utilities are relevant because that impacts what we pay our employees and what they're able to afford and how much their wages track with the actual costs of where we live. And we know that wages historically have been higher, but we also know that our per capita income has been getting closer and closer to US average, which means that our wages are not as good as they used to be. Our income in this state is not as good as it used to be. The other piece is healthcare. So healthcare is 50% higher than the US average. And I think we know statistics that Alaska's healthcare is the highest in the world, because if the US is paying the most for our healthcare and we're paying the most in the US, then our healthcare is functionally some of the highest in the world. And that is relevant because the municipality is self-insured. So we pay for the insurance, and obviously assembly members do not. Well, we do have access to the healthcare plan at full cost, but we are paying for the healthcare of our employees. And so that is great things like the Vera Clinic, which provides primary services. There's ways that we can reduce our healthcare costs, but we're still buying into the Alaska market of healthcare. And so that's the baseline. Then going to inflation, again, from the same report, April 2023, they are saying as of April 2023, they're still seeing a 3.1% overall inflation. Our housing cost inflation is 6.3%, so double of that average. And transportation even is 6%. And I assume that has to do with the cost of gas, which we certainly see here, ironically, because we are an oil producing state and we still pay a great deal in gas. And there's other reasons for that. But the point is that the formula does not account for these things, and it does not account for the cost to the municipality for providing services. So just on Wednesday, we heard about the cost of the fleet and the number of miles that are put on our vehicles, and the amount of miles also translates to the cost of gas. So this is what I mean, that there's some structural issues with the way that our tax cap works, and to the extent that the actual experience and the actual cost to the municipality are out of sync with these formulas, then we have to both subtract out of our budget those costs, or we're not adequately adding in increases to our cost. And so the point of all of this is it extremely constrains our policy choices. And I think to the point of, do we tax under the cap or to the cap? The question is, does the tax cap as it exists allow us to address the changing conditions of our city. And that is a much bigger issue. That is in the charter. That is not something we can deal with in the budget, but I think it is really a foundational point to understand as we approach this budget and as we think about the implication of cutting, basically making cuts, making subtractions from the budget, because what we're starting from is something that basically constrains us beyond our ability to deal with some of these other factors. And that is our operating budget. The other piece to mention, and then I will be done because I know I'm being wordy, is the other pieces to understand is the long-term story about the municipal budget is that our tax cap was created in the 1980s when the state provided both operating and capital funding that significantly offset the local responsibility to pay for our services. And so that's the other piece is that, and maybe we should keep going through. So
I do have a couple of thoughts or things I'd like to point out.
okay, yeah, go
So
ahead.
you did a nice job of walking everyone through this document. And if I just went to look up the consumer price index, because it's available from the Federal Reserve, and 2023, according to the CPI, is actually 4%, not 3.3. And the previous year was actually 8%, which is not really reflected here. And so it's just very interesting. And then the reason we are hired to review these documents and be really clear about it, I'm just going to put it out there. There's a line item missing a substantial element here, and that's a $2.5 million legal settlement that was outside of the cap that was to be paid next year. So their line is $827,500. You should go ahead and add $2.45 million to that, which if you go to your table, then increases the property taxes to be collected, but doesn't impact the collection under the cap. And so just there alone on this one page, I found you $2.5 million. And that demonstrates to us the work we have to do to make sure we get these records. And it would be great if Courtney were here to tell us, because maybe it does exist somewhere in there that we just can't see, but it's hard to grasp that at this time. Ms. Zalatil.
Yeah, thank you. So since we don't have the administration here, we don't know how they calculated the consumer price index. I think it would be safe to say it's probably flat from 2023 at the revised portion, 3.3% at minimum. And I think that's something probably worthwhile to include in our resolution. And we can put some facts and figures in there to back that up. Because if they can start from there, because if they start from here, we have an artificially deflated budget that doesn't necessarily, that I feel artificially lowers the tax cap in a way that isn't reflective of what we know about inflation. I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert on inflation, but I've read the news enough to know inflation is like the thing that everyone's talking about, and we're seeing it as a reality. So I think that should probably be added to the memorandum or to our resolution as well.
You know, not being the math wizard, I can tell my mistake, not on the legal settlements, but on the CPI, that's an average. And so you wouldn't get that from a table, you would get that from an average. So it would probably be a smaller marginal change, but that's why it'd be nice to have OMB here to help orient us. So Ms. Brawley.
Thank you. And I'll speed up now because I think to some extent the tax cap is an aside because it just is a constant, not Mr. Constant, but it is not something we can change, but it is a factor that we should keep in mind as we're looking at the budget, and also about when we talk about things like coming in under the cap and taxing to the cap, because the cap itself is a moving target and there are some things working against us given our current economic conditions. And so the rest of this essentially, as Mr. Constant pointed out, it subtracts out things that are not subject to the cap because again, not all of our budget is, and it's getting, the point of the cap is to get to the question of how much property taxes we can collect. And so to some extent, the other things under the cap are a zero-sum game, right? So we lost, $30 to maybe $50 million a year in state revenue to the city. And so what that has meant over time is every year we fill in $30 to $50 million more dollars of property taxes. And then that is also why there has been a project over several years to diversify our other revenue streams. Because if we don't do that and they aren't under the cap, then we have to pay more in property taxes because it's a zero-sum game. So all of that to say, this is partly why we're looking at a continuation budget. It is not because the goal is to tax as much as possible. The goal is to even just stay at baseline or at zero and to provide the level of services that the public expects. And I think as we continue to work through some of these structural issues in our budget around wages, around cost of things like our fleet maintenance and maintenance in general, I think what we're finding is that it is a challenge. And so it is difficult to come to a policy conclusion other than at minimum, we need to maintain our cap because the cap works against us otherwise.
Ms. Zalato.
Thanks. And so I think there's some confusion around the legal settlements lines. So if you look at line 13, that's being backed out as exclusions not subject to the tax limit from the prior year. So it means in 2023, it's estimated that we will have paid, well, wait. So it should include the additional settlements included from this year. So it would be, so that may already include the $250,000 settlement that was approved by the assembly, but not the $2.45 million. Okay. And then it says at line 29, added taxes for current year items not subject to tax limit, judgments, legal settlements one time. And that just remains open because we deal with it in the next year. And I'm seeing nods from Ms. Ennis, which is really great because she knows this inside and out. So, okay, thanks. I was a little bit confused, but that will substantially change the figure of what we're actually going to get to for a projected tax. As we start, one of the things that I know myself and Mr. Rivera are often asked is what is the average homeowner likely to pay for taxes with the proposed budget? And so we're going to have to add that in to ensure that we're having an accurate conversation with our constituents.
I would add, there's been a substantial change in the value of an average home, right? And so where in previous years we have discussed the amount of tax on an average home, and it was around $350,000. And so that conversation may change this year based on the wild increase in the property values that have occurred over the last 2 years. But we'll see what the department comes up with. Ms. Ennis.
One clarification. Let's say we have $2 million in settlements this coming year. That item is blank in 29 because those are paid outside of the tax cap. So you don't add that number to the tax cap. They're outside of the tax cap.
Well, so if I might though, there's no $2.75 million listed. And this is a limit on all taxes that can be collected. And then below is limit on property taxes that can be collected within the cap, right? So this should actually have both those collected outside the cap, just general taxes collected, and then those in a separate line 49 would be the difference. And so I think that line number 45 is very likely going to go up by 2.75 million. It could be 2.5 million. And then the line 49 will stay the same.
And we need OMB, of course. I am totally Maryland reliant on all this type of information, but I don't think it will go up that much. My confusion is why line 13, that 827, that's taken from this year's and then it's brought up over to next year's and subtracted. But we need Maryland for that. But I don't think, Chris, it'll go up by the amount of what we pay next year, the tax cap.
No, it's not. It's what we paid this year to Roger Hickle Corporation.
Okay.
Contracting $2.45 million plus the $200 and whatever $1,000 it was to the ombudsman's down staff. We paid two major settlements, and I can deduce that, that we knew about that $2.5 million isn't included in that. I can't confirm that the 240 isn't included in that for 250 because that number is smaller than 827. But we have one settlement that the language in the settlement stated specifically these are outside of the cap.
And Chris, again, with respect to OMP expertise, there's a lot of policy around what's considered a settlement. So is that because that settlement came from an appropriation? Who knows? It's
Right.
some type of, so we would need them to explain
I agree.
that. It's not just like a legal settlement.
But
of a
it
court
certainly
case.
was a legal settlement, but you're right. They might have it in another place, which is what we'll have to get to. We are running out of time. So, Ms. Brawley?
Yeah, thank you. And staying on that point, one speculation I have that we do need to confirm from OMB, I just realized $827,500 is the total of two proposed settlements earlier this year. One was $277,000 or $277,500, and that settlement was approved to Heather McAlpine. The other one was $550,000 that was not approved to Amy Demboski. And so I think what's going on here is that number is simply out of date. So this is an error. And then the third piece is it does not, as we said already, does not reflect the 2.45 million from the settlement that was approved to Roger Hickle Contracting. And sorry. Well, I think,
Oh, you're right. You think it's the first.
yeah, so I think this is a math error.
Right.
However, it's a serious math error and it has big implications.
2.5 million. Okay, so, oh, did we go to 2:30? Oh, I thought it was just until 2:10.
No.
Okay, so I think then we're gonna go with Mr. Rivera, then Ms. Alto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to clarify, great explanation, Ms. Brawley, on, for those that care, on the marijuana tax. So line 38 in 2023, 5.7 million, moves to line 5, 4.7 million in 2024, backing out the 1 million. And then if you go down to line 38 in 2024, it's blank because it's exempted from the tax cap in 2024. So I know that might come up, so just thought I'd go through it. Thanks.
I'm sorry, I was distracted. Would you briefly say that again?
I was just going through, so marijuana tax cap 5.7 becomes 4.7 in 2024, so 1 million reduction. And then that flows back down in 2024 to line 38 when it's blank because it's now pulled out of the tax cap.
Thank you. Okay, next, Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess a procedural question. So if Courtney had attended today, I would have had a series of specific questions for her regarding the 120-day memo that I guess Ms. Brawley didn't want to take, which is fair. So what procedurally, how would Assembly leadership like us as Assembly members to address those questions? Would it make sense to get them to the clerk and then this leadership could put the questions together and send them to the administration?
So I think that the best thing to do with questions is to send them to Desiree. And Desiree, you'll start compiling as many of the questions as we can gather. And, well, but I think, so our discussion is maybe at the budget meeting, the budget committee meeting, but I think maybe is 2 weeks too long? Should we give it a week and then ask for answers by the budget committee? Or should we, go ahead, Ms. Alto.
So if Ms. Peterson is able to make the budget committee meeting, I think we need to probably turn our attention a little bit to the 120-day memo and the questions. I think that is a priority. We can go through our typical, as long as we get our reports, we know how to read those. We're good at that. The 120-day memo and some of this finesse that OMB has to use for these numbers, I think we need to understand better. So we can then just, if we can confirm her attendance for that meeting, we can adjust the agenda appropriately to do that. But we could get the questions by, let's say, Wednesday of next week to Desiree so that she's got at least a week's runway on being able to compile the answers to those. Because we do know that they are stretched for staff up there and trying to prepare a budget.
Yeah. And I think that timeline is good. Like, if we have questions about the budget process, let's try to get them within a week or so that the administration has time to consume them and have reasonable answers. So it's not just I need to get back with you meeting. If, again, assuming they're able to attend. So, other questions? Ms. Zalatil.
Thanks. So getting a little bit further into the packet, when we do look at the CIP, or sorry, CIB, on pages C2, page 2, and page 3, we'll notice there's a lot of requests for the state. We weren't very successful last year. So I think we really need to take a close look at those, particularly in your districts. And if you think those need to be shifted into a posture for the bond versus asking the state. I know we kicked a lot of projects last year to the state that would have traditionally been on the bond. So you may want to see if those are delayed. I think I don't know if it's something for the resolution, but it's something we should definitely be tracking closely. It's one of the reasons we asked for more detail early, because I don't foresee the state being terribly generous in the next budget cycle to fund this amount of capital projects. I'm sure CAPSIS requests will go in, but that remains unknown. The other thing I would say about that is I would need to find out how much bond debt we're planning to retire and see kind of where that falls with the amount proposed by the bond. Here, it's not really a lot of money. If you look through these budgets or through this budget. So it's just something to keep in mind, as we had with, I don't know, previous work session, they all kind of blend together. But if some of these projects have delayed maintenance, they become bigger and bigger and more expensive later. So you may want to check in on a few of those.
Ms. Bronca, then Ms. Brawley.
So on the C2, page 2, top, it has Denina Center. And I thought all the money, and it's like, it has a state request there, but I thought all the money for the Denina came from the room tax. Is that not correct? Or is this?
So my understanding of funding for from the room tax to the Denina is that for the most part, that's paying off the bond that funded the building and construction. But there is a separate fund for operations, and so it's a fair question, but I don't think it's the majority of those funds. I think it's, if anything, a very small minority of those funds. Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that is a good question. What is that for? Because as I read it, it looks like it's $1.3 million. It's also true that as of about right now, the capital fund for the Denina Center, or I should say the Convention Center fund that was created through the bed tax, into which all of the money flows if it's not used for operations, is about $26 million. So it's an open question what we're asking the state for. And then given that, as you said, there is a dedicated amount of funds. But the other piece I wanted to address was the capital piece. So one thing is that in addition to the state operating money that we got that went into our budget in the past, as was stated in the work session on August 25th by Lance Wilbur, the state used to provide $75 to $100 million per year in capital funding. And he stated at that time that often it was used for paving local roads. So I don't believe that was the only use of it. But the point is that in addition to loss of state operating revenue, we have lost state capital revenue year over year, which I think is not surprising to people. But it is an open question then, if historically our bonding capacity has been commensurate with retirement of bonds so that we're not adding new debt, then we are $75 to $100 million behind where we were 10 years ago every year. And so that is another question to think about as we think about our capital projects and what we bond for. But the request then, and this is from the legislative committee, we are working on our legislative program, and one ask that we have to all members that Claire will be emailing out on Monday, but it's relevant by looking through this list, not just which things should go in the bond versus the state, but which of these long list of priorities are your district's top priorities in capital projects, perhaps other things that aren't necessarily monetary, but that's an ask that's going to go to all members. So I want to mention it now because parallel to us working on our budget, we want to think about what are our strategic asks to the state in terms of district level priorities, and most of them end up being capital projects that are relatively local. So that's just a preview, but please members consider that because we're going to have we're going to have a request that you provide that short list of priorities in time for the next legislative committee, which is September 21st as well. Thanks.
All right, next in the queue, I have Mr. Rivera.
Thanks. So I guess just to raise it here, I'm not necessarily encouraging we have a full-blown discussion on it, but just want to raise it here. I don't think this is necessarily something that we would ask Courtney, but it's really more of a policy call. I did notice in here that there are, over the course of 5 years, $6 million of, I believe it was in bonding. I think it was in bonding. I had to double check requests regarding the Sullivan Arena and Sullivan Arena repairs. And I know that there. Did you see it
I
already?
think I saw state.
Let me
That
just
was there for the
see.
state.
Page 3 of 3, C2.
If it is state, okay, well then, if it's state, then I guess I'm not as worried about it. But I mean, it still, I think, is a sort of a larger, interesting policy discussion to have about the future of that particular facility. Thanks.
What page was the Sullivan Arena on?
It's on C3 of 3, C2.
Just, it's in the alphabetical.
I thought I heard 6 million though. That's 2.7. So
Over the next 5 years, it's 6 million.
where's that part? I didn't see it.
Let me look for it.
They're in here. Like in the-
Oh, I see it now. Okay, it's page D3, page 7 of 27. Okay, thanks. So for the new members, I will just say this process is really healthy and a good process because pretty soon you're going to get a binder or 3 binders this thick with this kind of information that it's our job to go through in the same way very thoroughly. So this is just the warm up to orient you to the process, how we're going to do it. So Ms. Alatel.
Thanks. And I'm glad Mr. Constant mentioned that. So when we get those binders, we don't get them too far in advance of the first work sessions. And what I would encourage you to do is really think about where your priorities lie. Please get them to us through Desiree before Monday if you wanted to include it in the resolution. But the way I kind of tackle that, and I ask a lot of questions, is we get a snapshot of what the proposed changes are. And I think what we've got here so far in this resolution kind of tees up a series of questions about probably every one of those slides. Okay, so are those reductions the elimination of current vacancies within your department? Do you have any proposed or any things to help with retention or competitive employment to fill those vacancies? And then how do you intend with whatever you're proposing that are reductions to maintain a high level of service within those departments? And if it's to rely on contracting, how much do you anticipate that contracting to cost? Because I think what we got surprised by this year was contracting being used when we couldn't fill vacancies. So it wasn't anticipated in the budget per se. It was a reallocation of funding that would otherwise have filled vacancies. So just trying to kind of structurally, as you want to think about kind of maybe where we want to drive. And if we put them in this resolution, hopefully the administration is ready to answer those types of questions during the work session. I think it's really hard when we get the answers after the fact and later because we're taking in the information and we're synthesizing it to kind of drive toward what our budget amendments may be.
So to summarize, it's going to get complex and very interesting, and we're going to be riding a moving train and trying to keep it on the track. So, Ms. Brawley.
And I want to add just an observation that executive branch vacancies affect the assembly, and this is going to be a great example of that because it's more work for us to make sure that our priorities are maintained. It's a lot of work for us to go back and figure out, and this is not casting aspersions on OMB. It's just the reality that if there are not as many staff who can do this work, they do not have the capacity to work with us. And so it is on us. It is on all of us and our aides or whoever else we're having help us. And certainly we have great staff who are willing to do that. But I think this is another example where it's going to be inefficient and we don't get paid overtime. But in order for us to do our job, we do need to be doing this due diligence, and we are doing it with less resources, with less information, and so, and as I said, some other kind of handicaps in the formula that are going to get in our way.
So, Mr. Youngland, would you come up for just a minute? We have a question about a specific project. And we're just performing, we're demonstrating for you how this process goes in the future. So, Ms. Zalatil.
Thank you. So on the capital improvement budget, on page 2 of 3, C2, page 2 of 3, there's a Northern Lights Boulevard surface rehab from Lake Otis to Burgaw for $7 million. I'm surprised that's not something handled in the AMATS funding. Is that something that just was never nominated, or, and if it's a surprise to you, then that's fine and let you off the hook. But that seems interesting. We don't usually bond for those.
So they have been bonded for in the past. I did not know that that was in place, but it's not unusual for AMATs to not be included in Muni priorities or Muni projects. It looks like it's on the Muni portion of Northern Lights. So again, that's not really a surprise there. We do have a project on the other side of Northern Lights, Benson, that we are funding for the sidewalk pavement replacement, basically. So that's on the west side. I think it's from like Minnesota over to the Seward Highway portion of it. So I'm not sure where that project kind of came from.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful.
There's a second question to that. You were clear, and I looked it up on the map, and I agree with you that is a Muni portion of the road, but it's certainly within the MPO. Is it eligible for AMATS funding if it were to get into the flow there instead of being on a bond for the taxpayer to pay?
Yes, it is eligible. I would just need to then offset things that are already in the list
Right.
to cover it. And it's a pretty large dollar figure for pavement, even for AMAT. So that would just be up to the policy committee to make that kind of determination on.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out, and maybe there's some project that could be delayed or whatever. Okay, helpful. Thanks. You're off the hook, I
Yep.
think.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Ms. Branca?
So when you're looking through this list of things and like I think it was Goose Lake Park improvements, do you then go to the master plan for Parks and Rec so you can figure out exactly what they're doing with that? Just want to know my job here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is actually more information than we usually get in the 120-day memo, and I think that's because some of the leadership asked for that additional information.
No, the assembly passed an ordinance that said this is what we expect.
Well, there you go. Because if you look at prior years, we don't, like, the 120-day memo is like 6 pages. It's not this length. So what you will get when we get the full budget is, as the chair said, 3 different binders. And one of those binders will lay out all of these projects in detail. So you'll get to see what they are.
Just from I think probably Mr. Vaughn could speak to the frustration of what happens. You get to the end of the budget conversation and you have to take a vote on bond projects. And you're like, well, what about this project that my neighbors have been talking about for the last 3 years? And you probably have 7 members to vote with you to include it. And you're told by finance that, no, I'm sorry, you can't do that because it's too late. It has to go to bond council. There are so many steps to get it to ready. And so the purpose of starting 6 to 8 weeks early is to ensure we are looking closely at these lists. And if we have, as individual members and as a body, specific priorities, we have time now to amend the CIP, the plan, the CIP to get a project to the point where it could be on a bond by the time we have to vote on the final process. And so we're doing our very darndest to shift the calendar by several months to give you and each of us a true and earnest opportunity to have some say. Ms. Elton.
Thank you. I'm wondering if Ms. Costello could do a quick comparison for us on the request we made to the state last year that didn't get funded. If we could just get that list brought back forward to us so we could compare it to what we're asking the state for again, because that makes those projects kind of iffy and potentially delayed in terms of getting over the finish line. And I hope that we can be really mindful, as Ms. Brawley said, about kind of how much we're bonding for around what delayed maintenance looks like, and that we're so far behind. And a huge portion of that you'll find isn't just road resurfacing. A lot of it's drainage. And I think with these rains in these past couple, I don't know how many you all getting them, but I'm getting a lot of basement flooded emails within the district, and PM&E is doing its best to go out and make patches and do things, but eventually those are going to become more and more costly. So I think we have a real task, a policy decision ahead of us to decide how we want to look at strategically tackling some of this. Thank you.
Anyone else? All right, so it's always interesting. We're having these policy discussions as a branch alone. Thank you for listening, Ms. Costello. This is par, although at least this year we have a representative here that might be able to have some input in the process. So I guess that's improvement. And like I said, put your seatbelts on and put your safety helmets, because we're going to be riding through our probably most significant duty, which is ensuring and stewarding the budget to completion before the end of the year. So this is the beginning of our process in earnest. And so you've seen a snapshot, a taste of what the work is going to be. So take some deep breaths before those binders land on you, and review those projects and discuss with your community councilors their CIP lists. And I know that it would be great if we could fund projects for all of them. We can't. And so I do my best to caution my neighbors when they put forward those lists that these are aspirational. If there is a good opportunity that we haven't all the means together, you might get something funded. So it's not a promise, but get from them what's valuable so that when we're all together, we can make those assessments. So with that,
Can you tell us if you're going to publish the schedule for budget stuff meetings in like the next week?
yeah, so you should actually, I think we already did it. Maybe, did we already publish the schedule for our work sessions for the budget? Right. And
Okay,
so
great.
could we just put them in a simple memo that just says these are the dates and times, right? They're already sent to you by calendar invite, but know that these dates are challenging. The OMB has asked for us to be flexible with some of our dates. The trick is we have 12 people we're trying to schedule around. And so the earlier planning, the better, so that everybody can make their schedules work. And so there might be some slight adjustments from those dates, but you'll receive shortly just a brief email that lines out all the dates and times that you should already have received an invitation to. So is there anything else? I'm hearing and seeing none. We are adjourned. So we have another meeting.
I know.
So
I have to
you're
go.
not staying.
One quick second.
Oh, sure.
I was trying to text her.
And then she said she could be here.
So here's where we're coming to. Absolutely corner. I'm going to look closely. We put together the additional information.
Oh, but-
I felt for some